The Walking Dead audio comic is presented in episodic order. If this is the first episode you're listening to, please go back to episode 1 and listen from there. The following podcast is for mature audiences only. Listener discretion is advised.
Previously on The Walking Dead audio comic. Rick and Shane help the rest of the group with their shooting skills so that they will be better able to defend themselves against another attack. After finishing, Shane, Dale, and Rick go out into the woods to gather firewood for a cookout later that night. Rick makes a comment, and Shane's temper flares. At the cookout, the group gathers to eat, and everyone tells the story of what they were doing before the world fell apart. After the stories end, Amy jumps up to go to use the camper bathroom. As Amy returns from the bathroom, she is attacked by two creatures and suffers a fatal wound, which signals the start of a massive attack. The group leaps into action to defend itself, but suffers another blow as Jim is also bitten when he loses his temper and smashes a creature to death with his handgun. And now, issue 6 of The Walking Dead audio comic. Blood soaked through the arm of the coat that Jim was wearing as the group stood by the gravesite of Amy. They huddled as best they could under blankets to keep themselves warm. Andrea, Amy's sister, knelt on the ground staring down as Dale stood by watching with a mournful look on his face. Shane was the first to speak. She always had something to say. It's the one thing I loved about Amy. When we were all too shook up, or preoccupied, or just plain scared, she said something. She made us laugh, lighten the mood, no matter what. I wish you were here now. Donna, who was huddled under a blanket close to Alan and the twins, spoke up next.
We may not have gotten along, but I loved her. I love everyone here. We all lean on each other. We all need each other. This is hard on us all, but she seemed to take it in stride. We could all learn something from her.
Jim stood and stared at the grave as he spoke. She was a pretty girl, smart too. She should have been going to college, living her life, being young, being happy. This should never have happened. She didn't deserve this. His voice then lowered. Nobody deserves this. The group all turned to look at Jim as his face turned solemn, except for Andrea, who continued to look down at the freshly covered grave as tears streamed from her eyes. Dale looked back towards the grave and said, She came into my life at a time when I was ready to die. She gave me back my will to live, and I'll never be able to thank her for that. I'll miss her. We'll all miss her, Rick said as he stared over at the grave. She's not going to be the same. He removed the blanket he had been under with Laurie and Carl as the group prepared to head back to camp. Upon hearing Rick's words, Andrea started to cry harder as the loss of her sister finally started to sink in. Dale stood by watching her as Rick looked over at Shane with a look of apathy on his face. Shane could say nothing and just looked down, knowing that this was probably his fault. As the group moved out for the camp, Dale called back to Andrea, who was still kneeling by the grave. Andrea? She continued to stare down, either not hearing him or not caring to hear. Finally, he turned and left her to her grief. Back at the camp, Donna took care of Jim, who laid in a tent bundled up tight under several blankets to try and keep warm.
Do you need more blankets?
Donna asked Jim as she applied a cold compress to his forehead. Jim laid with his eyes shut and replied,
No, I'm fine.
As she continued to hold the cool cloth against his head, Donna said,
This should cool your face down a little.
Thanks, Jim replied as he opened his eyes.
Boss at my garage. First guy I saw attacked returned in a couple of hours. No one's ever lasted more than a day. Not after being bitten. Guess I'm lucky.
Donna looked at Jim with concern.
Maybe you won't turn. Nobody knows anything for sure.
Yeah, Jim said as Donna turned to leave the tent. As she opened the flap of the tent to leave, Donna gave a glance back towards Jim.
If you need anything, just give us a yell. Someone will come get me if I don't hear.
Donna left the tent and covered her mouth with her hand as Alan made his way over towards her.
Thanks for checking in on him, hun. All the other girls are too scared to get near him, and he won't let any of the men touch him. How is he?
Worse,
Donna said as she looked at her husband.
If what Dale said about his wife is true, he hasn't got long to go. Dale's wife turned in about half a day. Jim's going through the same stuff. It's just taking longer for him. He says his whole body is freezing, but he'd almost burn if you touched him. He's still got his wits, though. We'll see.
As the two walked away from the tent, Alan looked over at Donna and said,
Maybe it won't happen to him.
Yeah,
Donna said as worry came over her face. The two continued walking without saying another word to each other as they passed by Carol and Laurie, who were huddled under blankets trying to keep warm as the kids played together near the camper. Out in the woods, Rick, Shane, and Carl crept along trying to keep as quiet as possible.
No shooting today, Carl. Just watch us and stay quiet,
Rick said as he looked down at Carl.
Aw, Dad!
Carl moaned loudly, disappointed he wasn't able to help the two men hunt.
Quiet! You don't want to scare our dinner away, Shane whispered angrily.
Sorry,
Carl whispered back with a look of surprise on his face. Off in the distance, Shane heard something and held up his hand to stop the others, as Rick looked at him shocked he had spoken to Carl like that. He took aim and fired, picking off a small rabbit not too far away.
Good one. Few more of those and we'll be set,
Rick said as he smiled and looked at Shane. Without saying a word, Shane marched off to retrieve the prey he had shot. As Shane walked back holding the rabbit, Carl looked up at his father and said,
We don't have to get as much as usual, Dad. Amy's dead, and Jim's too sick to eat.
Rick just looked back at Carl, saddened at hearing his son.
I know, son. I know.
Suddenly, Shane erupted in a fit of anger.
God damn it, Rick! It's not my fucking fault!
Rick marched over to Shane, pointed his finger at him, and yelled back.
Like hell it isn't. I told you this was going to happen. We're not safe here. How many more people have to die before you realize that? If I thought we could survive on our own, I'd leave the rest of you here and take Carl and Laurie with me. We need to get out of here, Shane. Let's siphon what little gas we have out of the cars and into Dale's camper and go. Today. Right now. Let's just get away from the city. Find someplace safe.
Shane pointed his finger at his head and yelled back.
Think, Rick. We'll be lost out there. The army is going to drive through here any day now with supplies and shelter, and all this would just go away. I don't want to risk being out in the country. I don't want to risk being left behind. What are you basing that on? What indication do we have that we're not the only survivors? What was that attack on the camp? Are they hunting in packs now? We know nothing about them, Rick said to Shane as he threw his arms open. We're not safe.
Carl couldn't take the argument anymore, and with tears in his eyes, ran off into the woods and away from Shane and his father. With a surprised look, Rick turned to watch him run off and yelled after him, Carl! He then left Shane standing alone in the middle of the woods as he took off after his son. Back at the camp, Dale tried to comfort Andrea the best he could as she sat on the bed in the back of the camper holding her knees and staring off into nothing.
Andrea, if there's anything I can do,
Dale said to her as he placed his arm around her shoulders. He sat on the bed with her just watching as she said nothing back to him, her grief too much to bear. He kept his arm there and eventually lowered his head in sadness too. He didn't realize until then how much he missed Amy as well. Inside the tent where Jim was getting worse, Donna stood talking to him about what he wanted to do.
No, we can't do that to you. You could start getting better. This would be murder,
Donna said, distraught. Jim, who was getting weaker by the minute from the bite, turned his head to look at her and replied,
Donna, you don't understand. I can feel it coming. You gotta do this.
Jim turned his head away from Donna. He turned back towards her, his eyes barely open, and continued.
Please, they have to do this for me. Talk them into it. It's the only way I'll ever be with my family again.
Donna had nothing to say to Jim as a tear came to her eye and slowly streamed down her face. She knew he was getting worse and could think of no other way to help him. As the group gathered, Donna emerged from the tent and looked over at them.
Jim knows what he wants to do.
Sometime later, the group helped Jim to a secluded area by some abandoned buildings. As he slumped against a tree, the group looked on, saddened by the loss of another member of their group. Rick walked towards Jim and asked,
Jim, are you absolutely sure about this?
Jim could barely lift his head to look up at Rick.
Leave me. When I come back, maybe I'll find my family. Maybe they came back too.
His voice lowered as more of his strength left him.
Maybe we can be together again.
Shane, who was standing next to Rick, turned and started to walk off past the group as the rest continued to look on.
Goodbye, Jim,
Rick said softly as he turned to leave. The rest of the group turned back towards camp as Dale lowered his head and Donna and Alan hugged. They couldn't bear to lose another friend, yet they just had. Jim sat as the group continued down the path out of the woods and back home until they were no longer in sight, and he was alone. The next morning, Rick emerged from his tent, still a little sleepy, and stretched to try and wake up.
Ah!
From behind the tent, Shane emerged carrying a rifle over his shoulder and a roll of toilet paper in his hand. As Rick scratched his head, Carl popped his out of the tent.
Morning,
Rick said as he smiled over at his son.
Good morning, Dad.
Carl replied as he looked at his father. Shane, who had stopped behind the tents, finally called over to Rick. Hey, Rick, let me know when you're ready and we'll go hunting. Rick looked over at him and replied,
Just give me a few minutes to wake up and I'll be ready to go.
As Laurie emerged from the tent, Carl looked up at his father, a big smile across his face.
Can I go too?
Rick bent down to get face to face with his son, put his hand on his shoulder and said,
Sorry, son, not this time.
Carl looked back in his dad's eyes and pleaded,
But, Dad...
Come on, Rick, why not let him come along? Shane said as a slight smile started across his face. Rick turned his head to look over at Shane and replied,
Because we need to talk, Shane.
Shane stood and looked aloof as he asked, What do we have to talk about? Rick moved quickly towards Shane and angrily pointed his finger in his face.
What the hell do you think?
He yelled at him. Behind them, Laurie grabbed hold of Carl and pulled him closer to her, not expecting the confrontation. Without warning, Shane swung at Rick, punching him square in the face, knocking him to the ground. As Rick knelt on the ground dazed, blood pouring from his nose, Shane grabbed his chest and screamed down at him,
It wasn't my motherfucking fault!
Behind Shane, Laurie came running with a look of anger on her face.
You son of a bitch!
She yelled and smacked Shane across the mouth.
Ah!
As Rick pulled himself together and started to get up, he looked over at Shane. Laurie came running over to Rick and put her arms around him. As she did, she turned her head back towards Shane and angrily said,
Stay away from me, you fucking lunatic.
Shane couldn't believe his ears. He had no idea what to do next as the shock of what had just happened crossed his face.
What the fuck is wrong with you?
Laurie said, still staring at Shane, her face full of anger. Rick looked down at his wife, who was still holding on to him, and said, Laurie, as he tried to calm her down. Despair crossed Shane's face as the gravity of the situation finally hit him. These were his best friends, and he had attacked them. He could think of nothing to say to them as the rest of the group gathered, wondering what the commotion was. They all stood and stared at the three friends, stunned at what they were witnessing, and wondering what was going to happen next. Still, Shane could think of nothing as a tear started to come to his eye. Suddenly, his face was awash in water as the floodgates opened and his emotion poured out. He suddenly turned and marched away from the group. Fuck this! He yelled out. Rick stood holding on to Laurie as he watched his partner storm off out of the camp. He sighed and put his head down, knowing that the situation was good for none of them. He let go of Laurie and started off after Shane.
Shane, wait!
Rick called to his partner who was heading for the woods. Laurie fell to her knees and covered her face with her hand as emotion got the best of her as well. As Rick ran off after Shane, Carl watched him shocked at what had happened. Carol quickly made her way over to Laurie and knelt down to comfort her.
What's happening to us?
Laurie said softly as she stared at the ground, tears pouring from her eyes. Dale made his way over to Laurie as well and asked,
Laurie, are you okay?
Laurie continued to stare down at the ground as she replied,
It's never going to be the same again. We're never going to be normal.
She looked up at Dale as tears continued to stream down her face.
Just look at us.
Behind them, no one had noticed Carl run off into the woods after his father. Rick finally caught up with Shane, who had made his way far into the woods, still carrying the rifle he was going to hunt with. As Rick approached him, he called out,
Shane, stop! Stop!
Shane spun around and pointed the rifle at Rick, a crazy look in his eyes as he angrily screamed out,
What? What do you want? You come to rip my heart right out of my chest?
Rick raised his hands in surprise, not believing that his friend was pointing a rifle directly at him.
Shane, Jesus, what are you talking about? Be careful with that.
Shane continued his tirade as he placed his hand over his heart.
Go ahead and rip it out, Rick. I don't fucking need it anymore. Take it. Take it!
Rick was terrified as he continued to move closer to his friend, his hands still in the air. He had no idea what to do to calm his friend down.
Shane, can you please just put the gun down?
Rick pleaded.
You really did it for me, buddy. You really did it. Oh, yes, you did. I'm nothing now, Rick. Nothing!
Shane screamed out as anger and rage continued to consume him.
I've got nothing, Rick. No friends, no family, no respect, no fucking life. This fucking world, this fucking godforsaken world of shit. There's nothing for me here, Rick. Nothing! I thought I could make it. I thought I could hold out. Wait until they came and rescued us. They would have brought us nice beds and hot showers and fresh clothes. They were coming, Rick. We were gonna be okay.
Rick continued to hold his hands up as he replied,
We still are, Shane. Everything's gonna be fine.
Tears streamed down Shane's face as he started to calm down slightly.
I can't live like this, Rick. I thought I could, but I can't. I thought I could, and I did. Everything was going to be so good. She would have come around eventually. I know it.
Shane's voice then lowered slightly as he stopped pointing the rifle at Rick.
She would have.
A puzzled look crossed Rick's face as he dropped his hands to his sides.
What?
He questioned, but he already knew the answer in his heart. The anger, the jealousy, the rage, it all made sense to him now. Shane was in love with his wife and couldn't control his emotions seeing him with Laurie.
Everything was so perfect,
Shane said as his head lowered. Suddenly, another bout of rage swept over Shane as he once again pointed the rifle at Rick.
Until you came back!
Rick quickly raised his hands again in defense as he yelled,
God damn it, Shane, stop this!
A crazed look came into Shane's eyes as he got ready to pull the trigger.
No, Rick. This is the only way. This is what has to happen. You weren't meant to come back. You weren't meant to live. Please, Shane, don't do this,
Rick pleaded with his partner, his friend, as tears streamed from his face now. He steeled himself for the end when a shot went off. A bullet hit Shane in the side of the neck as a look of surprise and pain crossed his face. Behind him, Carl stood pointing a handgun in his direction.
Don't hurt my daddy again!
He yelled out. As blood sprayed from Shane's neck, he lifted his hand to try and stop the bleeding.
Carl!
Rick screamed out as he dropped to his knees, his son running full speed at him. Shane held the wound as the blood continued to pour out all over him. He held up his other hand towards Rick with a look of despair, pleading for help. Carl dropped the handgun as he ran into Rick's arms. As the two embraced, Shane fell to his knees right beside them. With a thud, he then fell face down to the ground, dead. Rick held tightly to Carl and softly said,
Oh, son.
The two both had tears streaming from their eyes as Carl lifted his head to look at his father.
It's not the same as killing the dead ones, Daddy.
Rick grabbed onto Carl and held him tighter.
Never should be, son. It never should be.
This podcast is not endorsed by Skybound, Image Comics, or Robbie Kirkman. It is intended for entertainment purposes only. The Walking Dead, all characters, names of characters, or other Walking Dead related items are registered trademarks and or copyrights of Skybound LLC and their respective trademark and copyright holders. The official Walking Dead site can be found at www.thewalkingdead.com. Songs: The Descent, Steel and Seething, and Undaunted by Kevin MacLeod. Main title theme by Gene Grasso. The Walking Dead audio comic is narrated and performed by Gene Grasso. All original content of this podcast is the intellectual property of Eugene Grasso unless otherwise indicated.